I'd like to call the special Mayor's Leaders Table meeting to order. I'd like to first recognize that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. Our clerk this morning, I believe, is Karen Robertson. Today's Mayor's Leaders Table meeting will be held in accordance with the Community Charter and Council Procedure Bylaw 2018 number 7272. Folks can join electronically, but I don't believe we've got anybody joining us electronically. First item on the agenda is the introduction of late items. Ms. Roberts, we don't have any. Everyone's got the agenda in front of them. Motion for adoption of the agenda. Moved Dave, seconded Bob. All those in favor? Opposed? None. Motion carries. And the first and only item on the agenda is the discussion of homelessness topic. And we have a presentation from Dave Whitty and Bob Moss. Gentlemen, we're in your hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. If we could pull it up.
And I should also mention, in fairness, before you get started, we have in attendance Vern Miller, Director of the Salvation Army, New Hope Center, and John McCormick, Executive Director of National Planning System.
Andrew Thornton. And Andrew Thornton.
And Andrew Thornton, whose name just went right out of my aging head this morning. Thank you, Andrew, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Just before we get started, just a bit of an introduction, and do appreciate this opportunity. It is a special meeting, and that we agreed to. This subject obviously is on a lot of minds. And before we start on the formal presentation, Bob and I just wanted to introduce a few words. Certainly, we appreciate all the work that the city's been doing on housing. That's absolutely fundamental to trying to address this significant issue. Some would call it a crisis. It's an emotional issue for a lot of people, first of all, and secondly, it's become very politicized, particularly in the last few weeks. So what we would like to do is we can set aside that emotion, set aside that politicization, and look at it for what it is, which is a fundamental challenge to society in many countries, in particular here in Canada and in Nanaimo, as we know. It was interesting. Every time I open the paper or see something, there's always something else that informs the conversations. And today, so this report that I sent out, I don't know if you read it or not, probably. There's a lot of material in there, and it's just I could literally update it every day, not every week. The latest today was in the Times columnist. An editorial by the Times columnist that said, basically, we need to step back here. This should not be a top-down process. This needs to be a bottom-up process. And I would humbly suggest to you that that's what Bob and I are trying to initiate here, and have been doing so since September. This is coming from citizens, from people like myself who see this as an issue and are trying to offer some direction and some comment based on experience and based on the gray hair and the opportunity I've had in my life to impact communities. Those are my introductory words, and Bob, I know I had a few as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And this is, of course, based on Dave's great work and research that he's done on this issue. So I've just helped with a few bits and pieces around the edges, but fully support the suggestions that are included in this. But I also wanted to recognize our quote that this table, I believe you established to provide leadership suggestions to you and council to how to move our city forward. And I think we would all say that leaders recognize the challenges that face our city, our province, our country, and the world. And they understand the need to prioritize challenges, review solutions, and then make tough decisions. And so that's part of what we wanted to talk about today, is those tough decisions and the resulting actions. So we're going to review the growing housing crisis in Nanaimo, including both shelter housing, supportive housing, affordable housing, and workforce housing, which all interrelate. And so we want to talk about those. And we propose that out of this, the leaders table would make some recommendations to the city as to how to put housing solutions at the top of the priority list, and to reallocate resources to try and achieve more of what we think needs to be done. After the presentation, we'll have hopefully a good time for discussion about potential solutions. And I think Nanaimo has the opportunity to be a leader in the province in terms of how we deal with this. It's not an easy topic, as David said, but we can take a leadership role here. And finally, just to add to what David said, this presentation is in no way a criticism of the work that is ongoing to staff, the work the city staff has done, the work that the SPO is doing. Rather, we want to talk about how we reprioritize using the city's resources going forward. So hopefully we can get where we recommend taking action. With that, let's jump into this presentation. I'm going to try and take through a few slides, and then Dave will trade it back and forth. So.
The person with the clicker runs the world.
All right, we can pass it back and forth. So, maybe I need to
If the clicker works.
I might have gone to sleep.
Does it have an on-off switch? Pointing in the wrong
I
direction.
might have gone to sleep.
Gone to sleep.
Okay.
Fortunately, no one else in the room has, I hope.
That's what the coffee's for.
You must have been listening to me all morning.
Okay,
There we go.
okay, so just the green one, right?
Yes.
There you go, Bob.
Oh, woken up. That's great. So, unfortunately, this is the reality of our downtown right now. Got it. And, you know, I guess the question for all of us here is this the new normal? We certainly hope not. This is not what we would like to think our community or communities in general across the country have to face. But Dave and I both live on Cameron Island, and on our walk here, we saw this morning, and it's part of living downtown. So, here we go. Here are some thoughts on how we got here. I need some clicker instruction here. So, homelessness has always been a challenge, and the challenge now, though, is it's becoming more complex and the numbers are growing very quickly. And it accelerated during the early 2000s as housing costs began to increase, and hard drug increased as well, drug use, and so that's contributing to it for sure. It's been an incremental process that has accelerated over time. And the incremental part of it is part of the challenge. So we're now overwhelmed by the numbers of homelessness. But society responds better to an imminent, immediate crisis than to incremental changes. And because homelessness has been incremental, it doesn't get the same reaction as, for example, COVID did, where we saw all levels of government react very quickly. But it is the same kind of crisis, and it's reached that level. So we have been struggling to solve the homeless challenge, but we need to change how we approach that. So what does that look like? How should we respond to homelessness? And that's the essence of what we want to review today. But first, we need to recognize it for what it is, a crisis. And some experts, including Canada's largest for-profit developers, say that it's a systemic existential crisis. And I think that's a good summary of it. Secondly, take a cue from the United Nations, which declared homelessness as a violation of human dignity in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was confirmed and acknowledged in Canada in 2019 as part of the Housing Strategy Act, that housing is a human right. Fourthly, and this is a really important piece in where Dave's work is really helpful to us today, need to recognize and learn from other countries and cities that have addressed homelessness in a successful manner. This is not a new issue, as you said. We need to learn from what others have done, fine tune it, and apply it here. And with that, over to Mr. Whitty.
Thanks, Bob. All right. What did you do to get it working?
Press the
There we
green
go.
ring.
Right. So who are Nanaimo's homeless? And many of us know this. Most of our fellow citizens are in fact homeless and they're from Nanaimo. So 71% in 2020, and the recent one that Andrew was involved in 72% had lived in Nanaimo for at least 5 years. A third are Indigenous, our population's 8%. And this is a quote from the 2020. The vast majority indicated that they are homeless, quote, due to affordability challenges and not because of challenges due to mental health or substance abuse. And in 2020 as well, 91%, which is a common number in other studies that I discovered in certainly out of California, said that as their first priority, you ask them what they want, they ask for access to permanent housing. The problem is, of course, it's too costly. Some of the work to date, the city has completed a number of important housing studies, no question about it. The city has made housing a priority, that's great. Good stuff going on. The city's partnered with not-for-profits, BC Housing, to provide hundreds of units. And the not-for-profits, such as Elena's Housing Society, are working hard to build more affordable housing. So there's lots of activity going on there. And as we've heard at this table, there's more housing to be built, and I understand there's going to be more conversation about that today as well. Here's part of the reality, though, that when we talk about the unsheltered numbers, and this is an interesting piece that Andrew presented to Planning Priorities. So I've taken it in your slide, thank you for that. So the percentage of overall city population that is unsheltered is not just about the numbers per se, but on a per capita basis. And that's where we recognize that Nanaimo is in deep caca, folks. Deep, deep trouble. Look at Red Deer, 0.09% of the population are unsheltered. Kamloops, 0.1%. Victoria, 0.05%. Lethbridge, 0.24%, which is getting bad. Look at Nanaimo, 0.4%. It's double Lethbridge. It's 10 times some of these. It's almost 10 times City of Vancouver, almost 10 times Metro on a per capita basis. So this is a huge problem for us. And if there's a city that perhaps can lead in addressing this and really needs to, Bob and I would humbly suggest that Nanaimo's the one. And so not only do we have a higher ratio of homeless in our city population compared to others, we also have the highest percentage of our homeless that are unsheltered. So good work, Andrew, thank you for that.
And if I may just interrupt for the sake of those who may be watching and listening. Being unsheltered means there are no shelters to go to at night. It's not that you don't have,
Yes, thank you.
which is a concept that many people who talk about this casually don't understand. In Vancouver, you may be homeless, but you have a far better shot at being in a shelter overnight at least, whereas here, you don't.
Correct, yeah, that's right, and on a percentage basis. But, whoop, see, it went back to that just to make your point. But why doesn't that want to go forward? Okay, so despite the good work just mentioned, the numbers of homeless keep increasing. So 2008, we had 174. Today, we've got 1,000 plus, accelerating a rate of 30% per year over the past 4 years. While the recent supply of housing has been significant, it did a good job, the numbers of housing and the right types of housing are not nearly enough. So, unless addressed in a more fulsome way, this is a potential, it's a projection by Whitty, but nevertheless, we could have 2,500 homeless in 2030, using a 20% increase per year, not a 30%. 30% is actually what's been happening. So just being a little more conservative on the projection. Now this is interesting, it's a couple of quotes, recent ones. This is just April of this year, mid-April. Quote, 8 years since BC declared public health emergency, toxic drug crisis rages on, Times columnist heading. And out of that article, quote, The Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users Executive Director Brittany Graham said all governments need to rethink their approach to drug users by recognizing the ways support systems fall short and leave those seeking help unable to get treatment when they decide to seek it. That's a real key issue here, and that's embedded in what we're going to talk about today. And as one frontline worker said, quote, "We are responding in a random way," end of quote. That is, we are reacting to one-off emergencies and needs instead of a coordinated, systematic, integrated way. We want to talk about that today as well. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why this is doing this. Here we go. We are spending approximately $21 million a year from all levels of government to support people on the street. That's support them on the street. That money could be redirected into housing as we purposefully provide to take people off the streets. And we've got a handout on that. And if you had the chance to look at the report, you'll see how that $21 million was generated. So a lot of this has to do with personal experience. And when I built my practice, it was around looking at what others did and trying to see whether it would work in communities and cities that I was working in. And this is just an example of that practice. So yearly visits to Switzerland provided a shocking contrast. There are no homeless on the streets in Switzerland. There aren't. I've been all over Switzerland last 7 years, just everywhere. In 2020, there were 8.65 million people in Switzerland. 2,200 homeless were identified in December of 2020, or 0.02% of the population. And yet, and then people say, well, everybody in Switzerland is Swiss. Well, in fact, 25% are foreign born. So it's not just about the Swiss turning their back on other people. In 7 years traveling there then, using Basel as a population as a base, I saw one shopping cart, no one doing drugs openly, no one passed out in a park or street. And I'm telling you, 174,000 people, and I walked that city everywhere. So living in downtown Nanaimo, as Bob referenced earlier, shopping and working and walking all over downtown. Both of us have seen numerous homeless clusters and individuals passed out, fire ambulance responses daily, absolutely daily, again today. A woman I've seen for 5 years, Indigenous woman slumped over on her cart, see her regularly, usually on her phone, talking to herself. Here she was as we came here today. There isn't a day in the last 2 years that when I go downtown, I haven't seen somebody. In fact, a few nights ago, Cindy and I went to a play downtown. Coming back, people passed out. One guy laying across the street, shooting up with this heating device. He had a flame this big. You could smell whatever it was. I told Cindy to hold her breath as we stepped over. We couldn't get by him. We get emotional here. We had to step over the guy. A young guy. We allowed that to happen. Crazy. So, why are we frustrated? As an urbanist and developer, we know we can do better. So, whoops. We think we do. So I decided to investigate Switzerland in May and June of 2023. Went there every year, and around 2020, I said, there's something going on. What's the difference? So I decided to investigate. And from that, discovered that the Swiss, the Swedes, the Finns, and many others are successfully managing homelessness. It became apparent that there was one common theme for all. Successful homeless management practices, housing first, or in the case of Basel, which is what we would like to call it, the housing first plus. We also discovered that housing first is not just housing, it includes the 4 pillars, the plus that we call it. Now, Andre Picard, I'm a fan of him, he writes in the Globe and Mail. In 2017, 2 weeks ago, he wrote this, quote, "If we want to reduce or eliminate open drug use and related public disorder, then we need to embrace all pillars of a comprehensive drug strategy, prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and enforcement." 2 weeks ago. And we're advocating that. I advocated that back in September when we had our first presentation here. I think maybe this needs a new battery or something. I'm hitting that in the right place. So I spent 20 hours, as we know, researching and writing that action plan for the 911 housing, and a copy was sent to members of the Mayor's Leaders Team. He wants to go and then stops. And then Bob has spent many years actively involved in encouraging the supply of affordable housing. So between the two of us, yeah, we are frustrated because we think there's answers out there. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about those answers today. So, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite to address all of the needs of homelessness. So why is that? Is that you or me?
It might be me.
Thank you. It's not just you, it's not just me.
Apparently need some training.
We're making a note to order a new clicker.
Okay, good.
So why are we not addressing homelessness in a comprehensive way? I guess we believe that too many of us have come to accept homelessness as a new way of life. Simply, it's become a problem over time, and small bits incrementally it's increased, and that's back to the incremental increase in challenges as opposed to a sudden one. Many of us feel overwhelmed by the issue and reluctant to try and take steps to address it. And many of us can and do avoid the direct impacts of homelessness by avoiding the areas where homeless congregate. And we certainly know that many people in our city choose to avoid downtown for that exact reason. They feel unsafe, even visitors. Many blame the homeless for their state of homelessness. They point to the fact that it's a personal choice and that some people just choose to live on the street. Well, as Dave has already explained, there may be a few, vast majority do not choose that. Many believe that homeless want to live outdoors. I know I've said to a number of people over the years, if you want to live outdoors, you certainly wouldn't choose to live downtown. There's so many nice places in BC to live if that was your choice. So I don't believe that's a reality. And we are providing more housing, and we could say market housing, so that should solve the problem. Well, yes, it helps in terms of the big picture, but it's not addressing the most critical issue, and that is trying to get people some places to live at a very affordable end of the scale. So, what have we created? This is what we see. Is it really a new class of citizen, our own untouchables? Let's hope not. Let's hope not. And this picture, I think, is particularly telling. Many homeless people actually look like us, and it's so true. It could be one of our kids. It could be one of us. Increasingly, seniors are an increasing portion of the homeless population, particularly single women seniors, which is very, very challenging, I think. So the comment at the bottom is, she is of no fixed address and patrols emergency shelters and homeless encampments. Proved negative, so they couldn't find her. And yet she's identified. So, Dave, back to you.
That's fine. So now what? Reality is society does bear responsibility for allowing our homeless numbers to grow unchecked. They are us out there. We either continue to respond randomly or we decide to act in a new, more vigorous way. It's not just providing more housing, although that will help, no question, and it's needed. No, we need to explore options that work elsewhere. There are proven solutions. Other cities and societies have addressed their homeless problem. Let's take a look. Well, first of all, talked before about Medicine Hat. This is, as you can see, in March of this year, an article. This is, Medicine Hat gets referenced a fair bit. I've talked to them and over the past while. So this is a quote out of that article, appeared in the Globe and Mail. Medicine Hat was one of the first cities in the country to commit to a housing first approach in 2009. I talked about that in September, you might recall. That approach was crucial to helping the city achieve its initial zero homeless figures. They've kept 1,900 people plus off the streets since they first adopted it. And in November 2023, they had 27 living on the streets. And that, picked that up because I had a long chat with them in December, and they had the November number. So that's 0.02% of population, which is the same as Switzerland, for God's sakes. 27 people out of 63,000, and I'm over 0.4%. And I must say, there are fans of Medicine Hat, and people say, well, no, actually, they've got some issues, They do maybe have some issues, but in November, they had 27 people on the street. So they're doing something right. So an option that works is Housing First, right? Housing First is a solid foundation. It is built on the idea that housing is a human right. Housing needs to be provided in a variety of forms and types to fit the needs of the homeless. But housing only will fail. Client-centered, individualized needs supported with wraparound services and supports are critical, including the 4 pillars. 4 pillars, addressing substance abuse, harm reduction, therapy treatment, prevention, and enforcement. And interesting, I mentioned in September, you wouldn't remember, this comes out of Switzerland, the 4 pillars. They've been practicing it since the mid-90s. And they had a huge heroin addiction problem, and they continue to use it. And it's, as Andrew Picard said, we need to do that in Canada. He said that 2 weeks ago. Measures to reduce those entering homelessness are also crucial to reduce the number of homeless. So that's the other thing, right? The issue for much of here is because of the housing costs. People are on the street because they can't afford housing. They get on the street, and then it becomes this terrible hole. And you're in the middle of winter, and it's raining, and you're cold and freezing, and someone offers you a way out, and that's a drug, and you say, I don't want to do drugs. Okay, I'll just do it this one time. Guess what? And if anybody had a chance to read that report I wrote, you'll see several quotes from people who were on the street who recovered, who said that's a real challenge, and you can understand that. And you see people in downtown Nanaimo in January, 5 days of rain, 0 degrees out, and snowing, and what are they going to do? Guess what they do? So we need to keep them in their housing. We need to keep them housed. That's absolutely critical to keep the numbers and address the numbers. So housing first. Current term Housing First in Canada is not well understood. So we're trying to address that today. Focus in Canada and Nanaimo is on providing housing, but that's not enough. Housing plus wraparound supports for each client, their clients. That's the thing, they're treated as clients, individuals with their own particular needs is a success. So therefore, we advocate for a term Housing First Plus. This was, guess where that was? We saw that downtown, right? It's now gone. I noticed the other day it's gone. Housing First Plus. That's what we need here. So the options. So right now, a huge issue is unaffordable. And that leads to homelessness. Now, the city and BC Housing and non-for-profit housing are trying to address that. And they're trying to take those numbers and as people are in a place of not affording housing, they're trying to, you collectively, great work, trying to address that, the numbers of people that are homeless. So this arrow shows that some of them are being taken care of, absolutely. But the problem is there are way more people entering homelessness than can be housed. So we end up with homeless people. And they have what we call an option B, because we think there's an option A. They have an option B, life on the street. And life on the street leads to a sense of hopelessness, absolutely. Read any of the literature. These people, they see no hope in the future. And that leads to a loss of dignity. And I know who pointed that word out to me. Thank you, Bern. That whole notion of loss of dignity is absolutely critical here. And that leads to continued life on the street because they don't know what else to do, which leads to a sense of hopelessness. The cycle goes on and on and on, but not for everybody. No, for some. This. Anxiety. Anxiety leads to substance abuse. Substance abuse, it's got its own little circle, and that leads to this. And that's unacceptable. We have to break that cycle, and that's the way to break it. Option A, Housing First Plus. This is not rocket science. It's proved in so many countries. God, that's what's so frustrating for me. Oh, God. So if we apply Housing First Plus, you see the size of the arrow is smaller because we're actually keeping people housed. Absolutely critical. We're keeping people housed. And it's taking people off the street. It's taking people off the street. Now, guess what? Not everybody, doesn't work for everybody. It's around 15% end up back on the street. We're never ever gonna have zero homelessness ever. but we're going to reduce the number significantly. And the way that that's going to be accentuated is through wraparound supports and supports. We absolutely believe that. So our whole presentation today is thank you for listening. We're trying to get things right. So Housing First Plus is cost effective. Finland has determined it saves 14,000 euros for each person taken off the street. That's after investing in housing and wraparound supports. So from a financial perspective, it actually works. They have proven, they've run the numbers, and they've mentioned this a number of times in studies out there. They've run the numbers. You actually save money by providing all these supports and building housing. Simply investing in Housing First Plus saves lives, saves money, and increases quality of life for all. Quality of life for the people on the street, but also for the rest of us living in the community. So Medicine Hat has actually, interestingly enough, now has moved to a more robust homelessness program because it can. So when you talk to Jamie Rogers, she says, quote, success looks different these days. We're not only looking at numbers, how many people are getting housing and staying housed. Rather, they're asking the question, what does that individual do they still have hope in their life? Are suicide rates going down? Have they reconnected with their families? I want to know about that kind of impact. Those are the 27 on the street now. That's what they're focusing on for those people. And that 27 is on the street. So I'm not going to get into this now, but if you want it, I've got handouts that talk about these numbers. If you read the report, you were able to see that what we have costs of approximately $21 million. No one's refuted it. We're spending on our street life. And if we take that and invest it in housing, and I had a table that showed that, over a 6-year time frame, I show that as well, we could end up with a total supports of $8 million for client-centered supports, $2.6 million for ongoing homeless needs, those are the people that would still be on the street. And after investing the $17 million, as I show how it could be redirected, in new housing at a cost of $65 million, by the year 2032, there could be 900 new special housing units and a savings of $17 million per year. Now, that $21 million I talked about is across all levels of government. But nevertheless, that's a cost to government. It's a cost to us as citizens. And what we're suggesting is, let's at least explore the idea that, like, servicing the people on the street, getting them off the street, you're going to save money and redirecting that money. Why can't we make that link? I just don't understand that. And it's not like I haven't done this kind of work in the past. I mean, not on homelessness, but for developers and et cetera. Like, I just don't understand why we can't explore this. Anyway, conclusion. Homelessness in Nanaimo and across Canada is an existential crisis. It deserves an equivalent response to ensure that the current crisis does not continue to detrimentally affect the well-being of those who are homeless and those affected by homelessness. Housing First Plus works. While the task is formidable, return on investment has proven to be significant, such as Finland, Medicine Hat. Got one more thing there.
We're gonna go,
One more conclusion. There you go. There we go. That's yours.
there we go. So I think this is really key, is that the alternative is not acceptable. We have to take action, and we have to make it focused action that is going to require tough decisions, and it's going to require us taking risks. Federal and provincial governments must be approached in the near term for their support to implement a robust action plan to address our homeless crisis. Both of those levels of government are making great announcements about the money that they're going to make available. We need to provide them with solutions and ask them for that money to apply to our solutions. So much needs to be done, much is at stake. Without a concerted action, homeless crisis will only get worse. This is fun. The best time to start to do this was yesterday, but second best is today, so completely agree with that statement. And so our suggestions. This table, going back to the leadership comments I started out with, recognizes the good work that the city in accelerating housing construction will not in and of itself address homelessness. It's important but we need to change the priorities. So we recommend and suggest, recommend to the city to initiate a Housing First Plus, take action, and finally address all of the requirements of homelessness, including long-term provision of affordable housing. I think we must be prepared to, as a city, reallocate resources so that we can take firm action now on this. And as Dave has pointed out, it will pay off later. Yes, we need to reprioritize those resources now, but eventually it will work out to our benefit long term. So what I'm hoping we can do now is just discuss some of those potential solutions and how we could make some moves today that will help put the solution in place. So with that, back to you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the work. I'm not being dismissive when I say it, but I have been saying these things as his counsel indirectly and through the creation of the SBO for a very long time. We get it. And so I want to ask something very specific. When you talk about reallocating resources, do you have some idea of what resources the city has control over that we can reallocate? And what would we do with those reallocated resources? Because we don't deliver health care, we don't deliver mental health and addiction services, we don't build the housing per se. We cooperate with BC Housing now. As you can see from material the city's staff have very kindly provided in terms of provision of land. And we've seen, as you pointed out and acknowledged, a number of units. Housing units in and of themselves, though, we all agree, for some folks, that's all you need. It's just poverty. They're on the street because they're poor. They got evicted or hunted because the house got sold, whatever. And the example you use, my standard line is, you've got a 67-year-old female who didn't work outside the home much. She's living on some CPP, old age security, the supplement. There was a front page story in the Times Colonist the other day about a woman in Victoria who may be facing rent eviction as part of a larger rent eviction. She makes $18,000 a year. She's not going to be able to afford $1,600 a month in the private market. All the way over to the, as I refer to them, a deeply addicted, now severely brain injured, schizophrenic, 45 years old, who is probably a candidate for secure and voluntary care for the rest of their lives, and everybody in between. So, I want to drill down on this. What is it you think we as a city are spending money now that we can reallocate? Keeping in mind, the same problem applies here, and I say this with some experience around government. It's the same with healthcare. On one hand, you know that the best thing to do in the long haul is preventative healthcare. It's getting people exercising, it's ensuring their diets are proper, they're not drinking too much, etc. But at the same time, up at the emergency ward, you've got 50 people who need service today, and that costs money. So how do you, coming out of the left as I do, and everyone's heard it, my first bit of fame was because I talked about if people wanted these services, they'd have to pay higher taxes. So I've been consistent now since 1990, I say with some pride. But assuming there is a limit to what taxpayers are prepared to pay, what is it you think we can do? I mean, very serious here. I would love to think that we can do something with city money that is reasonable, that's in our lane, that will actually make a difference, as opposed to what we have been doing, which is outlined in the material provided, which includes significant advocacy with the province, and the setting up of the SBO. Councillor Emmons was here with us this morning for a while, her and Councillor Bonner. The Health and Housing Task Force created the SBO. There's some good things happening, things that can't talk about, things John might be able to talk about as well, or Andrew this morning. Things that Bern is already doing and the Salvation Army has done for years in this community, God bless them. So I want to hear, as my friend with the lisp used to say, the specifics.
Okay, well, maybe I could go first, Dave, if that's okay with you. I think what we need to do is, when I talk about reallocation resources, why don't we create a directorship in the city as a director of housing? whose sole role is to move these pieces ahead. It's, I think, increasingly obvious to all of us that even though the money's available at the federal level and provincial level, we have to take very specific proposals forward to them to access those monies. And it's a challenge. I know from the nonprofit side of things, each of these projects that we want to try and move forward takes a lot of resources. We could allocate those resources. And yes, it means we're going to be spending money to do that. But perhaps in the short to medium term, over the next few years, we're better off spending money on that resource than we are, for example, more safety officers and maybe some of the other projects that as a community we'd like to do. But maybe we defer those by a few years and get some focused action on the housing piece. And across the housing spectrum, so not just the homelessness part, but the supportive housing and the affordable housing, because they all work together. They're all part of the solution. I think one example that is useful here is if you look at the project that the PDN undertook and brought forward to the city, they had a piece of property under contract, specific plan how to develop it for shelter housing, and the city worked with that, pushed it in BC Housing's direction, and BC Housing took over. What we've all come to realize, though, is BC Housing moves at a relatively slow pace, and we need to continue to encourage activity there. So I think there are solutions. We are going to need to spend some money, but we could acquire a property, get it under contract, we can plan the development, then take that package forward and insist that they participate. So that's my say on reallocation of resources.
And if I may, so there's that piece which is absolutely critical, but it's not we have a shortage of money in the country, it's how we allocate the money. And so the city of Nanaimo and the cities in the country are not in a place, they're not Basels, which actually are able to, they raise money through income tax and corporate tax. It's a whole different structure. And I talk about that in the report. It's a different structure, financial structure. But having said that, then on the other hand, you had Finland, which had a national homelessness policy. So the feds did it there. And we're caught in this federation that's all kind of based around 1867, not 2024, when we're 80% urban. So if we were forming a country now in Canada, it would look quite different. But the point is, the pie is the big pie. It's how the slices get cut. And if I were a municipality, how I would redirect resources, I would redirect, I don't know, $50,000 to host a national conference on homelessness with FCM, BC, I had it, no, I've lost the acronym, you guys.
FCM and UBCM.
UBC, thank you. And to have this conversation and put the heat on the other levels of government. If cities continue to do their thing individually, then not only are the cities in trouble, this country's in trouble. And it's because it's only going to get worse. And so, like, you look at little old Medicine Hat, you go, yeah, but they did this and they did that, and we don't want to do that. Well, you can still learn from them. Yes, the provincial government got involved, still gets involved. Well, that's a lesson for the rest of the country. Well, look, there was a commitment from senior level of government to help them out. Fortunately, it was in 2009, so by the time we get to 2024, they got 27 on the street in November. That's why. So, because they've been able to invest over time. But you have to start somewhere. And the more we say, well, we don't have the resources, sorry, we can't do anything, well, folks, it's only going to get worse. I won't be around to see that implosion because I'll be long gone. But it's coming, and it's coming hard and fast, and we have a choice to either address it sooner than later or just wait till we get rolled over by it. So I'm saying $50,000 to hold a national conference to host it on this subject. Like, why isn't some city doing that? I don't understand. And to explore how others have done it and then how we can make it work for Canada. And no one that I see is having that conversation, certainly no municipalities.
I'm gonna go to Don, then I'm gonna go to Joan, please.
I have a huge amount I actually want to say, so hopefully it comes out correctly. My first comment is $50,000 won't host you a conference of that amount. Trust
No,
me.
other people are gonna go in, I've done conferences, but anyway.
Yeah, well, I can tell you what the media campaign for healthcare looks like, and 50,000 doesn't cover a billboard allowance. So I think I've been pretty upfront at the other presentations that we've had. I disagree with the slide that speaks to the public response to how the public feels about homelessness. So I agree that it's been an incremental piece, and that's why it maybe hasn't got enough attention. But I think where the general public is at now is I think they're angry.
Mhm.
I think they've lost any type of empathy for homeless people. I think that, you become emotional when you step over people. I think the majority of the population doesn't necessarily feel empathy for those people anymore. And it's because it's been incremental.
Mhm.
And it's because the public feels that they've been dealing with it for such a long time, that whatever sympathy they felt before to help that person is gone. And so I don't work and live in the downtown, but I do work and spend the majority of my life on the hospital campus. And I can't speak to what's going on with the homeless people downtown, but I can tell you, because I've been accosted in my office by a homeless person, I've had homeless people go into my medical bills and beat up my staff. I've had homeless people rape my staff. I can tell you that our homeless people on the hospital campus, the majority of their issues are drugs. And they're at the hospital because the hospital gives out drugs. Island Health would tell you they are the largest drug dealer in town. And so that, we know that that's our problem there. But I have been open up front from the beginning that I don't support a housing first policy. I support a housing first plus policy as you've described it. I mean, we've had, obviously we've had huge association with the Salvation Army. We built the original New Hope Center. We love how that works. We have wet housing on the hospital campus. That would be the source of our major criminals. If you sit in my parking lot and what happens when it gets dark, and the prostitutes that come and stand in front of my medical buildings and accost my doctors who are trying to race to the hospital to help someone who is in critical condition or dying in the hospital, or if you sit and watch them come out and as they break in, and we watch them on camera breaking into our buildings and stealing stuff out of our offices, that's providing housing with no programming. And so my whole question isn't about how do we provide the housing. I understand we can allocate funds and the business side of me as a business person would argue when you say, hey, there's lots of money. Take a look at federal and provincial governments. Our governments are in debt up to their eyeballs. It's going to be about allocate with no plan to make repayments. I mean, I think at some level our governments are failing already from a financial perspective. So the only thing that will get traction from them will be some type of creative program that has private-public partnerships, because they're not going to be able to do it on their own. But that's a different conversation. I come back to the question, Dave, that I asked you, what was it, 3 months ago when we talked about this?
September.
Tell me how you're getting the 4 pillars. Because the thing to me is, I think we can sort out the housing piece in some creative strategy. And if it's just putting roofs over their head because what I'm hearing from your reports is most people will just accept a roof. But at wet housing, when the wet housing went in next to our building on the campus, I asked city staff, I said, so when those rooms are all filled up, do we think we've addressed the homeless issue? And the answer is yes. And I said, well, what is helping those people get from housing back into sustainable living and reconnecting with their family? Because there's no program there. Trust me, our security staff, and we don't have bylaw people helping us at the campus like they do downtown. We have none of that help. We're all hiring our own private staff. Trust me, I reviewed with my accountant last night how much I paid out of my pocket for security staff to keep my staff that help at the hospital or help maintain healthcare in our community, how much I paid my security personally this last year, because we don't get funding there. We follow them and they go back into wet housing after they spend the night sleeping in my parkade. And we're like, well, you have housing. Why did you break into my building and do all this damage, spend the night there till 5 in the morning and then go back to where you live? And the minute we get to their door to say, we'd like to talk to your staff about this, they're like, they're safe beyond this point. We're like, yeah, but they were just across the road, causing damage, harassing our staff. And so I think part of the general public frustration is that right now homeless people, in some ways, even though we argue about their lack of human rights for housing, have more rights than some of us who are out there trying to run our businesses. They have more. When we call the police for help, when one of my maintenance guys got accosted, the RCMP's recommendation was, and even though I had to get him into a program to get some therapy, we had to take him to the doctor to make sure he wasn't hurt, was don't press charges, because nothing will happen. So I think part of the frustration of the public is every time you say you want to give more rights, you take away rights from somebody else, and that's a frustration. So I come back to the same question I asked you then. Tell me how we change the federal judicial system that and it's noted, right? Enforcement, you talk about it. I agree, we need it. But how can this group change the judicial system that if somebody there is breaking the law, how are we changing it? How are we changing it so that people with mental health issues, that you can't now go and collect up and say, look, we know you have a mental health issue, we're gonna put you in this place where you're safe and we're gonna help you. Because we can't violate their human rights and pick them up and put them in a program that we all think, or doctors may think will help them. That's where I'm struggling with this whole invest money, and I think this is probably where everybody is struggling with it, is I don't know what the laws are in Switzerland around judicial system and rights of people with mental health issues and the drug, and the drug rehab, you can't force somebody into drug rehab. And let me tell you, from someone in the construction industry, do you know the highest numbers of people with drug issues is in construction? Do you know the amount of training we're doing out in the field to our guys about drug abuse? I mean, it's high, right? So, but how can we implement the 4 pillars? Because the housing thing, I can get my head around, but I don't support just giving housing and then allowing the drug use, the mental health issues, the crime. And that's where you're losing the public.
Right, okay. We're on the same page, absolutely 100%. And we said, and I said in September, there are other places doing things differently. Let's take a look at them. And I actually thought the conversation around the table was, yeah, let's take a look at them, but we haven't. So we're back again saying, let's take a look at them. It's not, and I think, I don't know how many times in the presentation, not just housing, that's not gonna work. It's a disaster. Look at what happened in Victoria. You get a hotel, you change it, and you give the rooms, and the guys go in and create fires, because there was no 4 pillars in place. This will not succeed unless we adopt the 4 pillars, period, including enforcement. That's proven. The Swiss were in worse shape in the mid-90s than we are now. 3,000 people in the major park in Zurich doing heroin. And we're talking about serious, just blood defecation everywhere. Like it was a gong show. It was on the front page of the New York Times. Switzerland is a gong show. Zurich's a gong show. Ha, ha, ha. People laughed at them. And so they said, what do we do? Well, we can do nothing. That's not the Swiss way. Let's figure this out.
But their federal government took that on.
Yeah, but in the end, it was the cantons that delivered. So they said, what can we do? So they tried and different methods, and they ended up with the 4 pillars. They successful. It took them 8 years apparently before all of a sudden the park was normal, and they were going, hey, we got a success here. Let's use this across the country. The feds were involved, absolutely, but the canton of Zurich was hugely involved, and then the other cantons as well got involved. But somebody has to start the conversation. No one is starting the conversation. Andre Picard here and someone there. That's not gonna work. Little Dave Whitty and Nanaimo and then Bob Moss, that's not gonna work. And, you know, if we come out of here today and say, well, yeah, that's an interesting conversation, it's somebody else's fault, then by 2030, expect double. And where the hell are we gonna be then? It's just, so the call here, and if you remember in that report, I start off with, this is a plea. It's a plea. And it's not like we're Zurich in the mid-90s where they had no idea what they were gonna do. We can point to success stories, and the government structures are different, and their financial structures are different. But that's across the world. Little old Medicine Hat, again, you know, some people would say, well, they get 80% of it right. Well, I'd sooner get 80% and have 27 on the street in Nanaimo and get 80% right. So what did they do? At least talk to them. Jamie Rogers talked. She'll come here and talk. She said she would. So why don't we have those conversations and at least give it a shot, not just have Moss and Whitty saying, we think you should try this. Give it a shot and say, you know, actually we explored this in detail, Bob and Dave, it doesn't work. We have SBO, we have that structure, and I advocate in the report, I say, great, but I think SBO, with respect, could, maybe you are doing more, I don't know, but and maybe you are gonna have conversations that I just talked about. If you are, then praise. But right now, where I sit, in the Beacon, every day experiencing what I experience, I'm going, you know what? This city is lost.
I'm gonna go to John. I'm beginning to think there's a conspiracy here based on conversations yesterday. I'm just joking.
We haven't
Well, that's an inside
we haven't
joke.
spoken recently. I love Dave, and we haven't talked in a couple, maybe a
Well,
couple months.
in fairness, I initiated that and I haven't heard back from you, zero, right? I gave you the report, never heard back. Needs to be on the table. So that's partly why I'm here thinking, who's dealing with this? You need to reach out, John. You need to reach out.
So I'm good with that. We did offer, we invited you to be on a research committee.
You did not. You did not.
We
I
did
have
two
no
face to
meaning.
face and you just.
Anyway, hang on. So here's the thing. There's a lot of work that's going on that I want to acknowledge the city's doing, and Dave, that you've acknowledged as well. And so that's important. There are national conversations that are happening. The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, we were at in Halifax in November, and it's holding annual conferences around this. They're bringing the political, they're bringing the people who make decisions at the highest levels to those conversations. We're having conversations with them. So some of that is happening. This is all, I'm just trying to help inform this conversation, because it isn't just, we're not just having a sort of a cry from the wilderness and no one is hearing it kind of a situation. We here in Nanaimo are actually, if we would like to and want to, we can bring the architect of Housing First to Nanaimo to help us. Dr. Sambaris has offered to be here and to help us work through his institute. I know him personally, as does Andrew, and we can do that work as needed. The first question he asked is, where's the money? Because that is a big part of it. And so the answer to that question is a question of for all of us as community members. It's also very much the thorny problem that you've talked about. We have a federal government that is almost incapable of having national programming because of the nature of jurisdictions in Canada. And so we have provincial governments that either are or aren't working well. I would suggest to you that, in terms of provincial governments in Canada, we're about as good as you can get right now, compared to places like Ontario and other places where that isn't the conversation. And if they're talking about housing, they're talking about 4,000 square foot units on 1 acre properties and clearing out the greenbelt for them. So we're in a better place here than we might be, but that doesn't mean we're in a great place. I'm going to suggest that across the province that we are driven to a certain extent policy-wise by environment, by the fact that people can be left outside in Nanaimo and not left outside in Smithers to the same extent. And they literally, when we compare how programs are delivered in those places and what the policy decisions that are made around those are, you can see that the environment plays a significant role. What happens in the interior in terms of programming with BC Housing and in extreme weather or emergency weather response is very different than it is here on Vancouver Island. That's a direct policy decision that's being made, and it's wrong. I contend that you house people, because they need shelter. It's no more fun to be in the cold and 0 degrees when there's a slashing rain, snow and sleet situation in Nanaimo. And it might be actually better to be in a place that's colder where you actually aren't wet. So these are significant things. There isn't enough money being used. I just showed the mayor a report just of the analysis of what happened with the outshop yesterday. And that analysis is sort of 2 years of information about what's happening on the ground here in Nanaimo with the outshop, which is survival gear. And the fact that we have to provide survival gear is a real indicator of where we're at. And the outshop is closed as of this past month. And that, I contend it's absolutely critical. Vern, you know how important the outshop is to that. So, there are things we can do that way as well. And we are trying to move along that continuum. I'm just sort of thinking there's just, to Donna's point, there's a lot of very good things that you talked about, Dave. So just wanted to mention a couple of other things. Prevention is a fundamental part of what we're looking at. And like healthcare, it's hard to sort of think about what the economics are of it to make it work, because prevention is always the thing in healthcare, but no one's ever figured out a model for how to actually deliver prevention healthcare. So, we work on the acute response to issues. When I think about it in terms of applying it to the housing situation, you're talking about people who are on the street, who are chronically on the street and are in very difficult situations. That's not the most efficient use of our dollars for housing people, frankly. They're the most difficult people to house. It's the most difficult scenarios. We've got, more than 50% of the population that's unhoused right now, over 40 years old. Andrew and I are trying to figure out what those numbers are, but we're looking at least 50% of them not actively in addiction, not actively in mental health, simply not able to be housed. So that, if we're thinking about the most efficient way to do this, the most bang for a buck, the most people we can house, we're focusing on that population first. We're also thinking about how we identify people who are at risk of being unhoused and how we can help to keep them stable and housed. Rent bank is probably the best way to do that. But we need to be much more active about it rather than reactive. Currently, the rent bank operates on a model of we wait until someone calls us and then we can respond. But what we can do, should do, is really actively get out there and take the risk that some people are going to abuse a circumstance, but that we try and keep as many people housed as possible by being much more active, proactive about how we deliver programming like that.
Basel offers a really good example.
Probably
We could talk to.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of those pieces as well. Another piece that's very interesting that we talked about yesterday is that we have community agencies, churches. We have some examples in Nanaimo of redevelopment projects that will provide housing, and we can move quickly on some of those and work with it. And we are starting that process of trying to work with the city and building the team and helping to hold the hand of community agencies and churches that have land. They contact me on a more regular basis now. Again, we're starting that process of trying to figure out how we can replicate the Brecon Church model in a better way than how it was done, because I think, Bob, you and I probably know what happened there. The not ideal circumstance, but it got to a housing situation that works for the church as well. So these are some of the things we can do. There's no disagreements here on where we need to get to in this regard. And then I'll say one other piece, and that is Nanaimo I think, very thoughtfully adopted the donut economics idea. And I think it's well placed. In the Canadian context, Nanaimo is on a different kind of an arc, I think, than other places. I've quipped that the fact that Harry and Meghan, when they got kicked out of Buckingham Palace, came to Vancouver Island first was not a mistake. They came here because it's Canada, it's warm, and it's surrounded by a moat. And I think that, you know, there is something to that. Nanaimo is in many respects, or for many people across the world, increasingly thought of as potential Plan D community, a place where they would happily invest some money. So
If they can't get to New Zealand first.
maybe, but then New Zealand's a very long way away, right? You know, so they like the shiny objects as well as anyone. So if we're thinking about what Nanaimo looks like in 50 years' time, when none of us here, well, subject to what happens with longevity research, is, you know, here to enjoy it, I think Nanaimo potentially looks like some of those places, Dave, that you're talking about across the world. I use Monaco as my example, but and I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. But if we want to get to that place, if we want to get to a place where everyone's housed, we to a certain extent need to figure out exactly what you're saying, which is how do we make this happen with our own resources too? So if we are going to that place, is there the potential, and cities do this on a regular basis, they borrow against the future. How do we potentially think about that too? How can we borrow against a really, what I think is quite a bright future, not a dystopian one, for Nanaimo, so that we can actually move this along? You know, we have challenges here. We are, if we look at Medicine Hat, it's shaped like a hamburger, we're shaped like a hot dog. There's a reason why we're shaped that way. That's because there isn't a lot of developable land, and so we're getting squeezed along a very thin wedge of coastal land that we can develop. This is a thing, it's a reality. Other places, you know, they can deliver services much more easily because they're circular and central in the way they can deliver these resources. So we have our challenges as well. And what you're saying, Dave, I think no one, as Mayor Krogh has said, we don't disagree. We wholeheartedly agree with every single piece of what you're saying in there. And our job, in part, is to, as the SPO, is to be a resource, to be for how we get to that place, and also to kind of, you know, work with great minds like yours to try and figure out how we bridge some of the pieces that Don was talking about, which are absolutely where the rubber meets the road. You know, this is where the ideas have been out there that we need to address it, but Don is right. There's a bit of a gulf between the idealism of what we're trying to get to and where we currently are in terms of where we are. I can say more, but I'll stop there.
I know Bob's next, but sorry, can I just comment on one thing, John? I don't want to interrupt you, Bob, but it's about the churches. Because I think I mentioned in a previous meeting, and Christy Woods did a presentation on what's happening with some of the groups. And my family, my sisters and myself, have been doing some work. We have 3 or 4 churches right now that, you're right, we're in discussions with them. And this is where I talked about the housing thing, I think has answers, but it involves public-private partnerships. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're dealing with 3 churches and then another not-for-profit right now. But I do want to say, I want to tweak in a little bit what Christy mentioned to us, and that's that when we talk to those groups about the housing piece, and they all talk about housing, and they actually talk about including daycares, which is another critical issue that we have. When they talk about prevention, a lot of it's about programs where we know people are not necessarily unhoused now, but will become unhoused. So they are like, what did I hear on the news recently about domestic violence and women who are now finding themselves homeless with children, and what does that look like? And so the conversations we're having with those 3 to 4 groups right now is we know that those people will become homeless. Just like we know a lot of children that are in the system will ultimately end up, you talked about it, Dave, that the people here homeless, a great percentage are Nanaimoites. Well, a lot of those people are people who are in our system now as children who don't necessarily, they're 18, they age out. A lot of young women that we're finding end up pregnant And I think I spoke to that, like our group, our family group is now coordinating through doctors about getting their young women support so that they don't end up homeless with their child out on the street, or their child taken away and their child becoming the product of the next generation being homeless. So I just want to tweak in on that when I spoke
that's
about
great.
that there's these public-private groups. The churches, to a big extent, and we saw it at Brecken, they are part of the answer on the how, and because I think the Salvation Army has proven, they're not just a church, obviously, but that they can play a role in the programming piece as well. I mean, that's what I love so much about the Salvation Army, is that when you're in, you're part of a program, you're part of a family group that it reintroduces you back into the four pillar piece. They provide that piece. And so I just, when you mention churches, I just want to say, yeah, we're actually working with a whole bunch of them.
We'll talk.
And
That's right.
and they can provide some of that piece that you're talking about with the housing piece. I just don't know how to get the criminal justice system online and some of that other piece. Okay. Sorry, Bob.
Before I go to Bob, I'll just interrupt and say there was a wonderful piece in the Vancouver Sun yesterday by a retired provincial court judge, Thomas Gove, who used to run the drug court in the downtown east side, and it addresses some of the things you've raised where there was, shall I say, I don't know whether it's been too much criminal law, but in terms of what we'll call sentencing that involve treatment, et cetera, and he's very intelligent. I sent it around to members of council, and left, right, center all agreed it's well worth reading, so I'll get that sent around to everybody as well. Bob?
Some great comments around the table, and I think we're all essentially on the same page. The question is how we quit talking about this and studying it and actually get something happening, which is, I think everybody knows, is part of my personal mission.
Let alone your t-shirt.
Yeah. Which I have more of if anybody wants them. I think Dave made a very good comment about bottom up. We cannot, in my opinion, wait for other levels of government to provide us with solutions. We have to take solutions to them and demand their support. And increasingly, I'm feeling like that's the only way we're going to get things done. Donna, you're doing that with the hospital side of things. It is the only way we're going to make things happen, in my opinion. So we need to work from the ground up. And we need to take risks. I think that's the thing that everybody's a bit concerned about. I hate to trot out Elon Musk again, but I'm going to. When you think of what he did with SpaceX, the fact that he was prepared to try various reusable rockets, he lost many before he actually got one that was reusable. Now he can put people and debris up into space way cheaper than NASA ever could. If we don't take the opportunity to try some different things, not everything's going to work, but let's try it. Let's see what works, and then let's build on that. So I really encourage us to get moving and do some things differently, and let's, if we can take projects forward, like where the affordable housing project, workforce housing, supportive housing, put them together with the land. Yes, we're going to spend some money to tie up some land. Let's put them together, take them forward to the province, take them forward to the federal government and say, here's what we're doing, here's what we need from you. If we can get to that point, I think we've got a way better chance of success. And is it going to be perfect? Absolutely not. But can we learn from it? Absolutely.
John, Andrew,
We've got a limited time, so Andrew probably has a lot to say too. So.
please.
I was just gonna, you all know this because you work in the area, land use or land costs is the number one thing around development. Bob, it's what we do for a living, you know that. One of the things that we've been looking at, I've been looking at since 2018, I don't know, Leonard, if you'll remember, first wrote, and the first thing I cited was Medicine Hat's first city to become zero homelessness. There's a contextual thing about that for 2021 and 2024. Population growth in Medicine Hat has been 0% in the last 8 years. Nanaimo's been 10%. So context is everything when we look at what we're trying to look at. And that's one of the things that we're all looking at. What are the structural drivers of not just homelessness, housing, employment? Because one of the issues that, again, we can begin to think about and begin to address, even if somebody gave us $500 million today, we don't have the people to build the homes, and we don't have the people to work to support people going into homes for supportive housing. The bodies simply do not exist. However, we can plan for those, we can create ways of staffing them. So those are, kind of some of the contextual things. And there are multiple sources of data we can begin to get a bit more focused. We've got the PIC count. We're building an interim by name list that will have maybe June, July, as well as the integrated data project the province is doing that Christy has cited and discussed in various council and GPC meetings. So we have a reasonably good idea of, we need this many acute care beds, we need that many for people who are just sleeping in their cars, that many for maybe people who are just, been on the street for a month kind of thing. So those kind of structural things. We're also an island. I don't think we've thought that through entirely in terms of how it drives homelessness. One of the things we're trying to understand through beginning to work with Island Health and MSDPR is inter-island migration of vulnerable populations. Again, very tricky, but will allow us to understand what we need to ask for. Because we're not just talking about housing, we're talking about the right kind of housing in the right places with the right support, which is all, again, that's where the conversation's pointing, but it's not just market housing, it's non-market housing. And that's being addressed by the province and the feds and the city through the housing needs report. And there's, really great tools out there for developing that. I had a meeting with Carolyn Witzman, who's the lead researcher at the Housing Assessment Research Tool at UBC. And she's like, yeah, come and talk to us. We will and Christy has, and Lisa Brinkman, that's how they built their report, which they have to redo again. And I know they're running around madly trying to look at all this stuff and to give us quite clear ideas of not just housing, but housing that's the right kind of housing. Now, that's where maybe some of the drivers of change can be. How do we build the right kind of housing? Exactly what you're talking about, Bob. This is the model. Private, public partnerships. The basic model that has worked is you get a private developer to build it, and you get a social or public group that runs it over time. That's supported by either the federal or provincial government or the federal and provincial government. There are models that work. This is how a lot of the housing in Vancouver is built, supportive housing and social housing. That's how it's done. Saying that's a lot harder than what it sounds like, but the model is there, and encouraging and trying to understand. I know the cost per foot of construction has radically changed even within the last 5 years due to COVID. Those kind of things, like I said, even if I give you $500 billion today, we would still be 20 years out by the time we begin to address just the people who are currently, and not just unhoused, but precariously housed. We've not even mentioned that. If we go back to Alina Turner's work, we're looking at, in Nanaimo, 8,000 people who are precariously housed. We need to improve that housing stock on top of building new housing, and not just for all the people who are coming here, which Leonard knows this, Bill knows this, Dale knows this, plus, the missing middle, which is now, that's become the dominant conversation, but it's kind of pushed away, some of this other conversation. And, and we can see the provincial government is very proactive right now. In particular, love her or not, Lisa Helps being assigned a special, I don't even know what her title is, but she's basically special housing guru, who, whatever problems there were in Victoria, she was there in the original. And one of the things that Victoria did, Leonard and Bill know this as well, and Dale, they put up money. They said, here's 60 million, province and the feds, you bring 60 or 120 and we'll get stuff done. And they did. They haven't solved it, absolutely not. But the ideas are there, the impetus is there. It's bad, it's getting worse, but there's never been a better time. It's the best of times and the worst of times scenario, I guess. You know, good news, bad news, good news kind of story. And Nanaimo, I think, is one of the things we're also trying to think about. Cities of this size, of about 100,000, seem to be having the worst housing problems and homelessness problems compared to other places, which is what was demonstrated in the ratios. What you'll see is, you know, places like, it seems like Vancouver, Toronto have hit their structural limits. There's just nowhere, there's no way, in a very weird way, to produce more homelessness, basically. But Nanaimo hasn't. And Nanaimo may never. And the other thing that's really important that's also mentioned in Dave's report, and everybody who talks about this, is addressing inflow. And that's a whole nother thing that we need to address and beginning to. And those are high-level structuralists. Leonard always says, you know, addressing inflow into poverty basically is a provincial and federal jurisdiction, as is demonstrated when the CERB was given out to people. I was just watching a webinar this morning, and it said we need to actually look at 2016 income distributions to really get the most precise, because the CERB bumped people who are in the lowest income categories up 1 or 2 income categories, moved them out of core housing need. And that's not the accurate picture, because now CERB has disappeared and people are sliding back down the income distribution scale. So that's going to make Christy and Lisa's job very tricky and Dale's in terms of trying to say, you know, what is our income distribution? What are our housing needs? How much road do we need to build? How much water supply do we need to expand? Not impossible, but a bit more tricky. So there's lots being done, and John kind of undersold the CADH. I mean, the housing minister was there. There were people from every major municipality, both in terms of social service and municipal leaders present, kind of leading minds from across the globe, talking about this. The housing minister even popped up and presaged some of the stuff that was introduced. And the Canadian Alliance has had a huge impact on the budget that the Liberals just produced about, you know, and it's being praised, is saying it's not enough, but seeing it's the biggest change in housing policy since the Second World War. Now, does it deliver, Leonard? I can see you, that's the question you're gonna ask. Is it gonna deliver? You can have a policy, but there's the implementation is, you know, proof is in the pudding. And Nanaimo is as bad as the problems are, we're just not quite, we're overwhelmed, but we're not quite submerged. So, and partially because the nature of the groups that work here are already reasonably well coordinated. They're under-resourced, but not to the point where they've had to shutter their doors. You know, Byrne knows about that on a daily basis from operational, you know, building a new building and trying to keep operations going at the same time with the same staff. Not straightforward, but he's doing it. And the other thing is we are building more coordination in the sector. That is not just within the sector, it's working with the city, it's working with RCMP, it's working with healthcare, it's working with MSDPR. Like I said, and just I'll end on this, it's really interesting to see Island Health and MSDPR are much more open to sharing data information than previously. It wasn't because they were callous, it's because of the consent confidentiality issues that are embedded in that. Again, everyone is well aware of. I'm sure you're well aware of. But are also there is a what would you call it? A whole team approach happening. We're not there yet, but as bad as it is, I get up every day and I come into the 250 Albert and I walk by and I talk to some of the people on the street, and that maintains my commitment.
I'm going to come back to something Dave was talking about, you know, some sort of a national housing conference, which to some extent is already happening. And it gets back to what I have said over and over again, and sort of basically 4 simple points. One, this is a crisis, and it is a national crisis. It's a North American crisis in some respects. It's not a European crisis, it's a North American crisis. And so you have to acknowledge it. And of course, as I always jokingly say, politicians are going to acknowledge this problem, because if you do, then people will expect you to fix it. But it's necessary, and it is the topic on everyone's lips. The good news to go along with that is, of course, we are less than 6 months from provincial elections, so everybody's sitting up and taking notice. That's why you see Judge Go's comments. That's why you're starting to hear this. And there's an approach on the federal level, you know. It's I won't call it a simplistic, necessarily, lock them up kind of process, but the reality is there are people in the streets who are quote-unquote capable and who are committing frequent crimes, and in ordinary at times would be in jail, right? And if they were lucky, I hate to say this, they'd be stuck away long enough to get into a program like we have at the correctional center at Brennan Lake, where they could actually get some treatment and be some hope, but we're not there yet. The second point I've said over and over again is you have to acknowledge we don't have bricks and mortar. And the province, to a lesser extent the feds, have to announce the money for the bricks and mortar. And thirdly, you have to acknowledge that we don't have to train people. With great respect, I am not patient enough. Dealing with people who have severe mental health addiction issues, just not my forte. I'm a fairly patient person, but I am not the person to do the staffing. So you got to announce the funding for the universities and the colleges to train the folks. And the fourth thing is you have to acknowledge that it's 30, 40 years of failed social and health policy that put us here. And so it's going to take a while, but you have to come back to your point, cycle. It's not just about the lack of hope for people in the streets, it's the lack of hope for other people. I think to some extent what Donna has said around people being less compassionate, caring less, etc. I don't entirely agree with that. And the reason I say that is I think the reaction to the decriminalization, which was a particularly British Columbia model, I think the reaction to it, which has been strong, it's come from people like me, it's come from all kinds of folks, is because the average person does actually get this. The concept that somehow you're going to remove stigma from drug use, to me, the line I use, it's the silliest thing, you're going to destigmatize drunk driving. Nobody thinks taking drugs that are potentially addictive and deadly and a poison drug supply is a sensible thing to do. And you're not going to destigmatize it. And I think what people have been looking for, and what I hear from all kinds of folks, is the same thing. Where's the detox? Where's the treatment? Where's the supportive housing? Where's the continuum of care? So that you don't end up in the severe case, damaging people's property, threatening, stealing concentrated, pay for your habits, whatever. So I'm somewhat more hopeful. The fact that we're having this discussion this morning, I think, is positive. The fact that you're hearing things from John and potential, what I will call specific things that we could actually do that would be useful to advance it. Plus the fact we're in a provincial election. I have to be an optimist, and so I am somewhat still optimistic. But the fact that this conversation is being repeated in the public sphere, not necessarily by people who want to keep their voices down, but by people who want to raise their voices, is still better than it was 20 years ago when we really started, or whatever date you want to pick, when we really started to slip down this road and have arrived at this place. And you know, the analogy of the old frog in the boiling water as opposed to dropping it in, it certainly applies here. And now we're in this horrible crisis stage. But at the same time, I just think there's a lot more interest and therefore I'm more optimistic, in particular because it's becoming a topic of conversation during the election, and there'll be a federal election too. And this is a national problem. I mean, pointed out in terms of the numbers, we face some particular issues here, the lack of shelter space, but I mean, I've never been a big advocate of shelters because I often saw it as an excuse for government to say, fine, we'll give you a roof over your head at night. Now, go off for the rest of the day and just live your life in misery in the streets and then go back to the shelter at night. It's not a solution. So having said all that, what I want to talk about, and let Bob go next, is, as I say, some things that we think the city could do in terms of allocating resources or specifics, or whether, and I'm not saying yes, but, you know, we call a conference here or something like that, I think council might find that appealing, I don't know. So, Bob, your turn.
I'd like to make a motion consistent with the presentation that Dave and I made. And that is that this table make a recommendation to council that City of Nanaimo, our city, initiate Housing First Plus program and take urgent action to finally address all of the requirements of homelessness, including long-term provision of affordable housing.
Now, what does that, before I ask for a seconder, what does it mean? Because the city's saying we can advocate for it, but everyone around this table fully understands that the kind of resources and the jurisdiction in terms of, you know, the city's not gonna suddenly start providing mental health and addiction services, right? I mean, I want to say something big, but that's a bit cheeky and unfair. We're not going to delve into matters that under the Constitution are strictly the provincial jurisdiction. So I like what you're saying, I guess, but I think it's got to be somewhat different. So tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking with that.
What I think is basically an umbrella statement that we could attach some specific actions to. But I mean, the Housing First Plus is a recognized way of addressing homelessness. And I think if we talk about urgent actions, that we can talk about specific steps that we can take as a city. But to build that all into one motion, I'm not quite.
Okay. The reason I'm raising this is, look, if this committee passes a motion, makes a recommendation to council, the first thing council does is punt it over to Dale or whoever and say, all right, what can you do? And Dale's gonna say, I don't know, so.
I kind of think it'll end up
I'm
coming over here.
looking to Dale to comment here, he's been marvelous.
So we have talked about some potential
Yeah.
solutions,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Actions.
So I think, well, first of all, I appreciate the conversation and listening this morning, and almost anything that's been said, I can't disagree with. I think this, for me, I think like Dave, I think you make a profession of seeing a problem, finding options and solutions, implementing them, and the problem goes away. For me, this has been the most frustrating topic I've ever done, because we implement options and solutions in the project, the problem doesn't go away. And a lot of it because it's beyond our control, and like Christy and others are talking about here, it's downstream. We're downstream in many ways. We're not upstream, so we're going through downstream, dealing with the outfall of it, like through our CSO program and clean team and all those things we have to do just to maintain livability of the city. I'm not sure that's what you were asking for, Your Worship, but I mean, some thoughts I have. First of all, like, having the city endorse a housing first policy, I would suggest that the city did that many years ago, continues to do that. We have not wavered from that. The city, I'm just doing a rough count off the top of my head, there's at least 6 or 7 supportive housing buildings now operating in the city. There's 2 more that are going to be opening in the next couple of years. There's a couple more after that we're actively working on. So we're going to soon have somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 supportive housing sites. And I think when the council of the day, and this council supported that and spent much significant tax money buying land to initiate those projects, certainly bought in on the principle that it was going to be housing and services, and that our role was to bring land, and that the province would bring the buildings and the operators, and then there'd be services wrapped around those people that were living on it. I think people could make an argument that there's not enough services in those buildings to make them successful. I don't know that I have enough information personally to comment on that, other than just anecdotally observing them. I I do hear from talking to operators all the time that one of the real realities is we can open these buildings, and I think we just need to acknowledge that there's a capacity, I think Andrew touched on this, a capacity issue with people working in those facilities. There's just not enough people with enough experience, I think, there to actually provide the level of supports that the city actually thought that there would be when we entered into many of those projects. I think in terms of reallocating resources, I think, you know, the city in that list that's in your agenda package talks a lot about things that the city's got way out of our lane and has been investing in the last decade and a half to try to address this. Investing in an SPO is a big step that's never been taken before. But if you just look at our land acquisition budgets and you compare them over the last 20, 30 years, I would suggest at one point, probably 90% of the land the city bought was for park. We bought parkland for park preservation. In the last 5 or 10 years, I would say it's 90% of the land we're buying is for housing. It's to do initiatives with BC Housing, to do housing first projects. Is it enough? I don't even want to pretend to say that it's enough. We could always use more, but we have had a reallocation of resources. I think the other thing when you talk about the city too, I think it's really important to remember, and everybody in this room will know that, maybe people watching, is that we're very limited in terms of where we get our revenues from. So to have a discussion about raising taxes to make housing more affordable, it's a difficult thing to do and leave it a push on. So pushing for the feds and the province, our own housing needs assessment that we just did recognizes that we need something like, I'm not gonna get the number, but it's like almost 50% of the new units we need to be affordable. So we're championing that when we talk to the province, when we talk to the feds. We can't do this without you. You can put targets on us, you can tell us to issue permits faster, whatever it is you want to do. Unless you're bringing money to the table, we're not getting to that 50% mark. And they seem to at least be aware or recognize that. And the only other point I wanted to make, and I think it's really, and Andrew, you mentioned context is important. And watching what's going on around the world, I think a lot of other places are looking at North America and seeing what's happening with fentanyl, and they're dealing with responding to heroin or a different drug. I don't think you can compare the two. I think the mayor and I talk about this all the time. I think there was a day when if somebody was on the streets and addicted, whatever they were addicted to, they could still come out of that, get treatment, and come back and be a contributing member of society. I think we have to acknowledge that many of the people we see out there now, they're not coming back. The brain injury is so significant that a housing first alone, or just housing or housing first isn't enough. And there needs to be some kind of higher level of secure sort of care facility for people if you really want to truly address it. So I think it's very different when you compare places. You need to be careful on talking about what exactly is driving the issues in those places. I'm not sure I answered your question at all, but I mean, those are some of the things I think are top of mind for the city. Absolutely, we would like more housing. Absolutely, we endorse the housing first policy. Is the province putting enough supports in those buildings? I don't have the answer to that question. I have my own personal feelings, but I'm not an expert on it.
Before I go to Dave and then to Don, I just want to tell you in terms of what Dale said around fentanyl that I had a roughly 10-minute spot on what it advertises itself as Canada's, Australia's #1 morning radio show the other day. And they called me from Australia, from Melbourne, to talk about decriminalization of drugs. Because Canberra, which I didn't understand, operates like the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia is kind of a unique creation in the United States for the capital district. Well, they're going to do the same thing there, and it's become the great debate in Australia. But they haven't seen fentanyl the way we've seen fentanyl, so it's it does have a very different impact. Dave and then Don.
Well, I think a couple of things that Dale, the task you've got it is huge, and I think, and it's not because you're sitting there, but the city's blessed with some really good people, right? And it's not because you're sitting there, Dale, and go, this is the truth, and you've been around the block enough to know. So that's great. And what you just said there, and you're recognizing that issue. I think that I guess for Bob and I, we've moved well beyond Housing First. It is Housing First Plus. That's the only way this is gonna work. We've got a misconception in North America about what Housing First is and our focus. And importantly, because that's your jurisdiction, that's what you can do is build housing. And all this other stuff is not within the purview, get that. So to Bob's motion, we haven't had a chance to talk about this. It seems to me that, one other thing, if I may. So, and I talked about that report. Whew, good on you for SBO, because the one thing I found when I did the research is you gotta have an SBO or the equivalent, right? And that's who I talked to in Basel, that group, and that was really instructive. So, but having an SBO in the current structures, in the financial situation is good, but what can you do? Because if you don't have the 4 pillars in place and those client-focused supports, which are very, very significant financially, then we're gonna kind of waddle along here. And this will not go away. And to Dale, your point, I mean, there's something that I talked about briefly in the report is that the drug crisis we have is really difficult and challenging because when a person overdoses, guess what? Their brain capacity diminishes. Another one, it really diminishes, and we're ending up creating this whole group of people that we don't know what to do with. And that will only get worse. It's only going to get worse unless we somehow intervene in some significant way. This will only get worse. We cannot manage it in the current structure. So humbly, we're suggesting the 4 pillar plus offers a window. Maybe it's only a little tiny spot of a window or a bit of a light through a window, but it does offer some hope. So how might we explore this? If the city isn't able to perhaps, and I get your point, Mayor, to adopt that emotion like this, because then what? But even, is it possible as a first step to recognize Housing First Plus offers a potential opportunity and solution, to then allow for a conversation that has not been held, in my view, that I know, but you're more privileged to know what the conversations are than some guy who's on the outside looking in. But it seems to me that if some city in the country was to say, look, we need to actually, as a group, figure this out. As folks, it's only going to get worse, despite all our best efforts, to at least explore what that is. I know this happened in Zurich in the 90s. They were absolutely desperate. They didn't know what they were going to do. And they decided to talk about it. And they talked about it and said, this might be a solution. And the federal government, certainly in Switzerland, got involved. But that Zurich canton was principally involved. And then out of that, guess what? They adopted this new approach and it helped immeasurably. So I think for us, it's about, if we leave the room today, for me, it's kind of, I've done my part. Good luck, folks. And you won't hear from me again, but made the effort. But it just, I think there's an opportunity yet to take a look at that little light shining through the window and see, can we make that fill the room with light and a way forward, and recognize in this country, if we don't work together on this, folks, this is toxic, unintended.
Donna, then Bert.
And can I speak to the motion for a second? So I just want to say, I also would like to leave the room with a motion today because that's what this group is about, right? That we're about creating change, and impactful change for our community. From everything that I've heard today, I think everybody in this room supports Housing First Plus. So I don't think that's a question or up for discussion. What I heard you reference what we're doing with the healthcare conversation. So I just want to look at what we want to get out of the motion, and I just want to reference back about how we got started on where we're at right now. So when you guys see all the stuff we're doing in the press, that's the Fair Care Alliance. That's where the community organization has really taken the conversation, making it their own, getting it out to inform people. And a lot of the stuff in the report, the general public doesn't know. You're right, if they're avoiding downtown, avoiding the homeless conversation, they don't necessarily know it. But I come back to the conversation that you mentioned right at the beginning, Dave, and that was not top down, but ground up. So just let me explain for a minute what we've done with the healthcare conversation and how we have gotten to where we are now. It sounds to me like there's lots of groups working on this homeless conversation, both, and we know the city's actively working on it, SPO's working on it, I know Salvation Army's working on it, lots of groups working on it. We know that that's happening locally, it's happening provincially, and today federally, I'm hearing federally, so there's lots going on. The same thing exactly was happening around our tertiary hospital. Island Health was having a conversation, MSA was having a conversation, the family division was having a conversation, the university was having a conversation about how are we staffing people. All of those groups were all having conversations, and in some cases, those conversations actually were conflicting with each other on certain points. So to say that Island Health and MSA 5 years ago when I started with MSA was on the same page would be completely, totally inaccurate. But what we ended up being able to do was change those conversations so that everybody was having the same conversation. And then actually what we did was form a healthcare ecosystem that sits above the Fair Care Alliance. Remembering the Fair Care Alliance is the community advocacy group before we turned it over to the public to help create the Firestorm. And that ecosystem is going to last forever. And what that is that's Island Health and MSA and the Family Division and then the City of Nanaimo and then the Regional District Hospital Board and then Vancouver Island University all sitting at the table together wearing and First Nations, SFN sits there, First Nations Health Authority, the group is big. And it will continue to grow because we recognize who the players in the conversation were and we're able to bring them to a table where they then created a mission and a vision as a grassroots group. But that, not to take out the importance of what the City of Nanaimo has done to that group because it has been due to the Regional District Hospital Board, they sit at that table as opposed to, they didn't start the conversation. The conversation started by creating a group where everybody sat at the table and agreed, and in your case it would be those groups, and maybe this already exists, those groups independently at the table agreeing that Housing First Plus is the model. And so what I'm hearing, the intent of the motion is to say that you want this grassroots organization to exist that's going to promote the Housing First model, of which the City of Nanaimo would sit at the table as one player, SPO would sit at the table, whoever the other people are. So can the motion be something along the lines of that this committee is suggesting that, and it's not, our model ecosystem isn't taking up staff who are paid staff, we're all volunteers sitting at the table, that this group supports something like an organization or an infrastructure like that comes together, that ultimately you want to have this broader, bigger conversation. That means you've got to have people from the province agree to sit at your table. You've got to have some kind of federal leader agree to sit at your table along with the city sitting at your table. I think in that respect, then Nanaimo would be very unique because then it would really truly be this grassroots organization who is bringing those other people to the table. And that's where we're finding our success in the healthcare piece, because even from forming the ecosystem, we're seeing drastic change in what the conversations are. You're seeing things like a heart health clinic outside of the hospital starting for patients. And that's happening because those conversations are now happening within the ecosystem. I think if a motion came to this table that said, hey, could we create some kind of, whatever you're gonna call it, network or fabric like that we would ask the city then to participate in, but you'd have to identify who those groups are, and you would never catch everybody on the first pass. It could be an organic thing that is growing further. I don't think it's hard for this table to say we recognize that Housing First Plus is a model we'd like to see moving forward, and we would like to promote having this grassroots organization. And then we could go to council and say, would city council agree to take part and be part of this grassroots organization, along with the Regional District of Nanaimo should be there. Island Health should be there. I mean, I could share with you right now that there's a 2-year waiting list to have a hip replaced, but the number of amputations for orthopedic surgeons is off the charts because of the fentanyl crisis. Trust me, they're interlinked. I'm just saying from my experience in the healthcare conversation, it really came I'm not saying that the city wasn't on side, and I don't wanna take away from, that they put motions on the table that enabled it to happen, but that ecosystem was evolving below the surface, and which then the city was able to step in and be part of it, and contribute at that level. And I haven't heard that there's some organization, I know not-for-profits have an organization where lots of churches have it, where they all meet independently, but if there was some way to bring that fabric together that would go on for the future, is that a possibility?
I'm gonna go to Barry, then I'm gonna go to John, and I'm gonna remind us
And then-
that we gotta finish by 11:09, so we gotta get going, and I have to get going.
Yep.
And I'm thinking that what we may need is a smaller group to just have a little chat outside of the meeting at some point and come up with a motion that could actually be useful to council, so to speak, and at the same time, I hate the old story, but kick the ball down the field a lot more than what we talked about. Please,
Thanks, Mayor.
you've been very patient.
No, I'm very grateful to be here, thank you. As you know, I'm new to the social service sector. I've just been here 2 years, and since I arrived, I have been aware and grateful that as I walk down the street and I see what confronts us in the city of Nanaimo downtown, I'm grateful that my heart still says, you have the capacity to do something. I can help this guy. I can help the sidewalk to be a little better and the neighborhood to feel better. And I go home and I do feel grateful that I have the capacity to do something. And it strikes me as I look around this room, there is a tremendous amount. If you stack up the years of education in this room, it's pretty staggering. And people with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. I think that gives us pause to stop and think. We've got a tremendous amount of capacity to act or to do something, and I mean that to be empowering. I'm just really humbled that we have that ability in this room. I was told when I first got here, take a snapshot of the whole situation, the whole gamut, from where people are entering homelessness to where they're on the street. Or the people you're working with, don't worry about it because they're going to be dead. That takes care of itself. I thought, what a cold vision. And yet, if you stop and really look at it coldly, it's true. We're trying to help people, but the number of people that we can intervene and help to move into a really healthy place, like Dale said, it's really hard work, and that's a tremendous amount of resources. My previous life was as an educator and as an administrator of schools. And I've always looked at the resources that I had, the human resources, the teachers who were trained in specialization, whatever finances I could put into play, and I put as much as I could into grade 1. Because I know the $5,000 you spend in grade 1 translates into 8 times that by the time they're in grade 12. And so we know that early intervention helps. Where, the story where we're looking at the river and wondering where all these dead babies are coming from. Let's go up the river and look at it. We know that that's what we need to do. And I don't think that we're sitting here saying, wonder what we should do about this. We know what the problem is. And we know we need to intervene. We need to intervene at a lot of different levels. I put a lot of time and energy into working with the people who walk in the door. And if I sit and look at it cynically, and say, okay, so Greatburn, you get 24 beds for emergency shelter, and you threw another 10 beds at it, that the Salvation Army kind of couples together and gets fucking covered and pay for that. That's 34 beds in the city, and look, there's 20 across town. That's, I think, 50 if we're generous. And how many homeless people have we got? Andrew tells me there's,
Several hundred.
okay, several hundred for sure.
Several.
You start to feel a little bit like that hummingbird trying to put the forest fire. And yet there's virtue in the hummingbird doing it. So I think at all of these levels, it does make sense that we're trying to do what we can. But boy, do we ever need to look up the river and say, why? And what do we do actively? What do we do? Because the more of our resources we can put into grade 1, the less problems we're going to have at the other end. That's my lived experience. And Donna said something that really got me thinking. She talked about the freedoms of individuals and do people still have the empathy? I kind of think, if we look at freedoms and the protection of the individuals, what they require is dignity, and there is no dignity in just being endorsed for whatever you're doing. People don't put their hand up at career day and say, I think I'd like to be homeless, addicted, and brain damage being thrown in. That would be a real bummer. Nobody wants that. They arrive there at a discreet falling away of all the supports until they have no dignity and they have no hope, and they no longer see the capacity that their life could be different. Which, thank God, we look around this room, every single one of us, if we choose to go to the gym, we can do it. If we choose to have a little less to drink, we can. And we're dealing with a population that is on this slide that takes them on a terrible journey, and they end up dead. And I think the only way that we can preserve the path to health and to wholeness, they do need dignity, they do need hope, and it does require some parameters along the way. So I'll stop in 12 seconds here, but I do see this flow. I'd love to be out of business. I'd love the tap to turn off out there somewhere. But I think we need to recognize that there's going to be needs all the way along the way, and that people will need to be supported, not only meeting them where they're at, but loving them more than allowing us to leave them there. We need to help them to have the supports and even the vision and the hope. I mean, the Salvation Army, that's their big banner, giving hope, giving hope, giving hope. If people don't see a capacity for things to be different and have the supports to get them there at all levels, we're not going to keep them in their housing, even if it's precarious. We're not going to move them back into housing while they're still capable of managing to keep a house. And we're not going to be able to help them as things have fallen completely apart to be able to integrate with some degree of success in whatever kind of supportive and transitional housing we can give them.
Thank you.
I just want to pick up on cognizant of returning into potentially emotion or some thinking about a good way to move this forward. Your comment about how you've worked in healthcare and trying to bring the pieces together. Part of the development of the SBO and the Health and Housing Action Plan was the Health and Housing Task Force, and it's it's on my docket to reconstitute the Health and Housing Task Force, whether we call it that or call it something else. So it's imminent in that regard. It could be reflected in the motion that we move quickly on that and actually really invest in that as a way to bring the resources together, specifically around the land, to actively move forward with all of the pieces that go into this. It's a multi-pronged, as Bern's saying, multi-pronged approach to this, and we have sort of quite genuinely, there's a very organic conversation that happens. But to your point, having a table at which the key players are around it and are making commitments and with the key players who can make commitments to it. So I'll stop there because we're at 11 o'clock right now.
Can I suggest then that, I think there's a good motion somewhere in this discussion, but it's not going to get drafted today. And so what I'm going
We're
to
happy to help in the drafting.
might be a time to bring people together too, if they're willing. And perhaps, I'm looking at the three of you, I'm not going to put one more burden on my friend Donna Hayes, all right? I'm sorry.
Good advice.
Love her to death, but and run it by her by all means, but I am not going to add one more straw to that all-burdened camel of compassion. So I politely suggest that's how we end the day on that understanding and get something drafted and run it by Dale, because look, ultimately, this is gonna come back up to council and I'm, as I say, I'm very practical. There's no sense talking about saving the world when you could be spending money on planting trees today. So if that's acceptable, looking around the table. Dale?
As long as Dave promises to not leave here feeling deflated and he's done and
Oh, I told him he can't take his book and go home.
No,
I'm just given another
I didn't,
task.
and I would never do that, only I would do it if I thought there was no hope, but I see some.
Okay, good.
So always hope.
Yeah, so well, sometimes where I see something, there isn't. So, there we go. Okay, yeah, we'll
Thank you.
have a chat.
All right, motion for adjournment. Moved Donna, seconded Dave.
Yep, thanks for listening, folks.
All those in favor?
Thanks, everybody.
Carries, thank you.
Thank you.
That was